What is art? How do we define this thing we call art? I would like to suggest that the way that we define art depends on our cultural context. The reasons people produce art depend on cultural context. Even the value of a work of art is dependent on cultural context. So what do I mean by that? Let's compare an abstract painting and a quilt. On the one hand, quilts made by women in the 19th century were not originally intended to be art or thought of as art. They were intended to be used as functional objects. They kept people warm at night, but they were also beautiful, and in the 20th century, museum curators have admired the quality and the compositions of these quilts. They've chosen to exhibit them as works of art, in part, I would suggest, because of how much they resemble abstract paintings, as you can see here. A painting like the one on the right by Fred Tomaselli, however, has a very different purpose and a different inspiration than this quilt. But I chose to show them side by side because of how visually similar they are and how similar their compositions are, their colors. He is inspired by abstract art as well as psychedelic and punk culture, very different than The Quilt by Rebecca Scattergood Savory. His painting is meant to be viewed in a museum or a gallery, not used to keep you warm, right? But just because something is in a gallery does not necessarily mean all the time that it is art. On the other hand, if art is a constructed category, who is the one who constructs that category? Who defines it? Some, like the critic Arthur Danto, argue that the art world decides what is art and what is not art. The art world says that the Andy Warhol Brillo box is art when it is placed in a gallery, which is different from the same box in a grocery store. It's the art world that defines this category called art. This simply means that the definition of art depends on cultural context. It changes over time based on the society in which it exists. Many cultures, in fact, do not even have a specific word for art. In ancient Greece, the word that included art was techne, related to our word technique or technology. It indicated something made with skill, requiring a special body of knowledge, and painting and sculpture were included in this term, but so were lots of other things that were made with skill. The Japanese have a word, here's techne. Japanese have a word katachi, meaning form and design, which can include furniture as well as painting and sculpture. Here's a tea bowl. In Europe before the 15th century, sculpture and painting were not a separate category, separate from other forms of craft. But in the Renaissance, they were elevated above other forms of craft. So the definition of art changes over time. What is your definition of art? Consider for a moment what you would define art to be. What would you consider your definition of art to be? I often hear students say that art is the expression of an individual's creative vision. Sometimes they say that it's the emotional expression of an individual artist, that it depends on that individual's desire and vision. It's whatever that individual wants it to be. And this definition works well for our time because we can think of someone like Van Gogh. He pursued his vision of the world in his painting despite all odds, and he ended up as a genius, an individual artistic genius. His paintings express not only the world, the landscape around him, but the interior world. Somehow his paintings of flowers and landscapes express his interior emotions, the interior landscape of his soul. So Van Gogh is a great example of an artist who expresses his unique creative vision and even his emotions in his art. But have all artists in all times and places used art to express their individual emotions or individual visions? Let's take Egypt, for example. Art in Egypt did not change for thousands of years. Did each artist working for Pharaoh have the freedom to express his or her individual vision? No. Each artist was part of a workshop that had to adhere to strict standards. They could not deviate from the canon of Egyptian art. There was no room for freedom of expression. Rather than expressing emotions, Egyptian art is intended to promote the power and godlike status of the king, here the king and the queen. So it's not the individual expression of the artist. It is the artist who has to submit to the authority of the king and the canon of Egyptian art that did not change for thousands of years. So you see the role of the artist changes over time, and the role of art changes over time. What is the role of art? If art differs across cultures, and people from different cultures and time periods make different kinds of art for different reasons, what are those reasons? What are those purposes? Why do people make art? We're uniquely driven to create, to make visual expression. So we're going to talk about these purposes of art, and the list that we give cannot be exhaustive, but it can give us some idea of the reasons that people make art in different times and places. What are other reasons besides expressing inner freedom and creativity? What are other reasons for making art? What are other functions of art? Well, art can create a place for some human purpose. For example, Maya Lin created a space for the purpose of memorializing Vietnam War veterans. Art can, secondly, create extraordinary versions of ordinary objects. This flask is an extraordinary version of an ordinary object. It comes from the 9th century. But so is this teacup covered with fur from the 20th century, an ordinary object turned extraordinary. Art can give tangible form to the unknown. Often that takes the form of the supernatural or the spirit realm, gods and goddesses. Something that we cannot see with the human eye, art can try to somehow express the unknown. Art can also record and commemorate. The Taj Mahal is a mausoleum built to commemorate. And so, in the same way, the Last Supper records and commemorates Christ's Last Supper with his disciples. Art can give tangible form to feelings and ideas. Again, Van Gogh, he gives tangible form to feelings and ideas. Through his landscapes, they express his feelings. And finally, and sixthly, art can refresh our vision and help us see the world in new ways. So a photographer like Dorothea Lange helped us see the world around us in new ways during the Depression with the photographs that she took. Andy Warhol does it a little differently. He creates a new reality, marrying repetitive screen printing processes with images of celebrities in order to comment on the produced and artificial nature of the images of these celebrities and the personas that they project. So he's helping us see the world around us, the world that we might not even notice, in a completely new way with his art. So if we know these functions of a work of art, we're well on the way to understanding its meaning. What else do we need to do to understand a work of art? Let's step back for a moment. When we come across an object of art for the first time, we can simply observe. We can observe its physical properties, its materials, and its techniques. What is it made of? How big is it in relation to the human body? What techniques did the artist use? These are basic observations we can make, and they can help us understand a work of art. Then you can quickly move to analyzing visual or formal structure. What is the visual or formal structure in terms of its color? What are the shapes? Is the color vibrant or dull? What's the texture, the volume? For example, you can look at the composition, and in these two paintings, they have very different compositional structures. The painting on the left creates a sense of stability with a triangular composition. Mary's body, sitting on the rock, is roughly triangular. On the right, the composition arranges the figures and objects diagonally, starting at the bottom left and moving up to the top right. So those compositions are quite different. You can observe those compositions. We might ask, is the painting symmetrical? What shapes make up the painting? And as we do this, we can realize that throughout history, theories of beauty have linked beauty to qualities such as symmetry, such as simple geometric shapes and pure colors. We can say that, on one hand, that beauty is something that attracts, because in nature, male birds attract mates with their color, flowers attract pollinators with their color and form. But even though we can say that beauty is attractive, can we define what characteristics define beauty? What characteristics do we value in a work of art, and what do we consider to be beautiful? Well, no one has been able to agree upon a single definition of beauty. Any strict definition seems to remain mysterious. But we can also ask, must art be beautiful? Is it okay to make art that's about pain? If life is painful, can art be about pain as well? Some would argue that the message of the work is more important than its beauty. Is the message more important than what we see visually? Well, this brings us to our third step, identifying subject matter or conventional symbolism. As you can see, number 3, identify subject matter or conventional symbolism. So in the case of Raphael's Madonna, with this triangular composition of reds and blues and greens, we can go beyond just looking at the shapes and the colors in the painting. Who are the figures in the painting? To know that, we must understand its conventional symbolism. In Renaissance paintings, Mary always wore blue, so we can know who she is. We can identify John the Baptist because of his traditional skin that he's wearing. The goldfinch in the painting is a symbol of Christ's death on the cross. So that's symbolism that you need to learn about to understand this painting completely. In some cases, the first 2 steps can help with the third step. So once we've identified physical properties and visual or formal structure, actually doing that can help us identify the subject matter of the painting. What does it mean? So an example of that is in Matisse's piano lesson. He chooses a form he sees in the metronome, this pyramidal form that sits on the piano, and he then repeats it in the green triangle in the image. Identifying these elements of visual structure help us identify subject matter, because in this instance, the form of the metronome sets the visual agenda for the piano lesson painting. We know that a metronome offers a steady beat to the musician. The boy in this painting can see nothing but the ticking of the metronome, which focuses his attention on the task of playing the piano and the hours of practice. And that repetition of that form just enhances the intensity. So we get a sense of the boy's intense concentration in these long hours. And part of our understanding of that meaning that's expressed in this painting comes from our identification of the forms, the colors, and the shapes within it. Another way of saying that identifying visual structure helps us identify subject matter is to say that form and content unite. They are united to make a meaningful whole. All art is a unity of form and content. All art has form, like formal properties, visual properties, and subject matter. The best art unites compelling subject matter with compelling form, uniting form and content. One way to put this is to say that art is embodied meaning. Of course, there are artists who even try to reject this idea of art having any form. Maybe they just want to make art that has content. Those would be conceptual artists. But we'll get to that later. There are also artists in the 20th century who've claimed to make art that's only about form. They say that their art is only about color and shape and line and is completely devoid of content. But is that really possible? Even if a work of art is about color or flatness or line, it's still about something. It still has content. So in the end, all art has content as well as form, even when art is non-representational. Sometimes the way that art looks might seem strange to us, but a bit of research can go a long way to helping us understand. For example, we might wonder why Picasso made these drawings and paintings that looked so strange, but it might help to know that artists in the 20th century who turned to abstraction were looking to other cultures beyond the West, for example, to African masks that had both abstract and representational elements. So knowing the context of Picasso's work is very helpful. Here's Picasso's painting inspired by African masks. Knowing the context is very important. So this brings us to our next step, which is to integrate art within a cultural context. So an individual artist is important to the creation of the work, and we might want to know what the work means, but it's also important, in order to understand the work, to look at the cultural context in which that artist lived. Consider the cultural context of every work of art that you ever study. Art is not made in a vacuum. All art has a context. Who is it made for? There are people who are influencing the work of art beyond the artist. Kings, religions, museums, their communities. Some people make art only to be seen in a museum. However, you might want to ask, who was the original audience? Because throughout history, most art was not made to be seen simply in a museum, set apart from the rest of life, but was meant to be integrated into life. So a painting, a sculpture, a stained glass window might have been made for a temple or a church or a mosque. You have to imagine the original architecture with rituals and worshippers and people within the space surrounding the work of art. A different context gives different meaning. So, for example, you can see the difference it makes to look at this piece simply in a museum versus in context, in the cultural context, within the performance of the rituals and masquerades, places where people were using it in their lives. Today, things have changed a little bit. There are artists who make art specifically for the museum context. That's where they want people to view their work. Tom Friedman intends his art specifically for the quiet, empty, white spaces of contemporary galleries and museums. And the work, for him, loses something when a collector buys it and takes it out of that context. So you always have to ask, how was cultural context relevant to the creation of this work of art? What was the political context? What was going on politically in the world around the work? What was the religious context? What art came before? What came after? How was the artist responding to other artists? All of these questions will provide strong footing as you aim to understand the diverse works of art that we will see going forward in this course.